At exactly 5:47 a.m. on January 12, 1943, a mechanical scream shattered the sub-zero silence of Ypsilanti, Michigan. It was the first shift bell of the Willow Run bomber plant, a sound that signaled the beginning of a daily exodus. 42,000 souls, men and women from every corner of the country, streamed through the massive iron gates. They were not there for comfort. They were there to forge the ultimate weapon of the 20th century, the B-24 Liberator. But there was a truth the generals and the Ford executives rarely discussed in their high-level briefings. Without fuel, the machine stops. And for the 42,000 humans at Willow Run, that fuel was food. What emerged in the shadow of those bomber wings was not just a catering service. It was survival architecture on an impossible, almost terrifying scale. Ford's cafeteria system would soon evolve into the second largest food operation in the entire United States, surpassed only by the United States Army itself. Every single day, this invisible machine consumed more raw resources than the entire Nazi Wehrmacht required to feed its entire Eastern Front during the height of the invasion. Yet, the commander of this domestic army was a woman whom history chose to erase from its pages. Her name was Edith Clark, but if you were to open the personnel ledgers at Ford in 1941, you would find her hiding behind the name E.M. Clark. This was a calculated deception. Ford's management knew that union representatives and male foremen would never accept orders from a woman in an industrial environment. Edith had started small, managing a predictable dining room at the River Rouge plant for 1,200 workers. It was standard institutional work: meatloaf on Tuesdays, apple pie when the sugar rations allowed. But when Willow Run opened, the numbers moved from the thousands into the millions, and the mathematics of hunger became incomprehensible. Ford gave Edith Clark exactly 3 weeks. 3 weeks to build a feeding infrastructure that did not exist in civilian America. There was no blueprint, there was no manual, and there was absolutely no room for a second chance. Edith spent those weeks standing in military mess hall lines at Fort Custer, watching how battle-hardened sergeants moved mountains of protein with assembly line precision. What she witnessed chilled her to the bone. Military kitchens operated on the cold logic of survival. Calories were a requirement, but taste was a luxury. Morale was never a line item on a soldier's tray. Edith knew that the American factory worker would not survive on such a grim philosophy. They weren't soldiers, they were citizens. If you fed them like inmates, they would work like inmates. She realized that morale was the secret ingredient that would determine whether a bomber stayed on the ground or took to the skies. Her first executive decision shattered every efficiency model Ford had ever designed. She refused to centralize. She demanded 12 separate self-contained supply chains and 12 independent kitchens scattered like combat outposts across the mile-long factory floor. The engineers mocked her, calling the plan a wasteful redundancy. Edith stood her ground. She knew that a worker at the far end of the plant would never spend 40 minutes of their break just walking to a central hall. They needed food to be close, they needed it to be blistering hot, and they needed it immediately. She wasn't building for convenience, she was building for resilience. The statistics of Willow Run were never supposed to work. They defied every law of civilian logistics. 12 cafeterias, each one a self-contained fortress of steel counters, industrial-grade stoves, and walk-in refrigerators the size of small suburban houses. During peak hours, these kitchens served 4,000 meals every 15 minutes. Let that sink in. Not 4,000 over a lunch period, but 4,000 every single quarter hour, ticking like a metronome of human hunger against the relentless clock of war production. 18 tons of meat were delivered daily, arriving in a constant stream of refrigerated trucks that had to navigate military-grade security checkpoints, unload in designated zones, and disappear before the next shift change gridlocked the service roads, before the first light of dawn even touched the Michigan skyline. 90,000 eggs had been cracked. Each one was a fragile calculation in a system that simply could not afford a single morning's failure. Deep beneath the factory floor, the bread was the silent crisis. Each cafeteria required 2,200 loaves daily, not delicate sandwich bread, but full 1-pound loaves that a worker could break apart with their hands during a 10-minute break. The ovens in the basement never cooled below 400 degrees. Their heating elements glowed with the same intensity as the forges shaping bomber fuselages 3 floors above. These bakers, men like the Polish immigrant Józef Czarnecki, worked alone in 120-degree heat. Józef worked 73 consecutive days without missing a single shift. His hands were covered in burns that never had time to heal, and his lungs were slowly filling with white flour dust. When asked why he pushed his body to its absolute breaking point, he spoke of his brother, an RAF pilot flying Spitfires over the English Channel. To Józef, the bread wasn't just food. It was a holy promise that the fight would continue. Coffee, too, was treated like ammunition. Ford's management tried to eliminate it to save on shipping weights, but Edith Clark fought back. She had interviewed the machinists and learned a vital secret. Coffee was the pause that prevented catastrophe. A worker grinding turbine components couldn't afford a single second of distraction. 10 seconds of lost focus could ruin a part worth $600 and 3 days of labor. Edith ordered industrial percolators capable of brewing 60 gallons per cycle. The coffee tasted like punishment, but it kept the eyes open and the hands steady at 3 a.m. In this world, the kitchen had become a weapon of war, and Edith Clark was its chief tactician. The human cost of Willow Run appeared in places no official production report ever dared to measure. Inside Edith Clark's kitchens, the conditions were often more brutal than the assembly line itself. The heat was so thick it made breathing feel like drowning. Noise from the massive exhaust fans left ears ringing for hours after a shift ended. Grease fires erupted without warning when boiling fat dripped onto heating elements designed to run 24 hours a day without cooling. Scalding water and steam sent workers to the infirmary with second-degree burns on their forearms. Yet the pressure never eased. 18,000 people expected their food exactly on time, every time, regardless of equipment failure or human exhaustion. Turnover was brutal. Edith lost a third of her workforce in the first 6 months. Men and women quit after 3 weeks, transferring to the assembly line because, as they put it, at least there you can see what you are building. Edith couldn't offer higher wages. Ford's union contracts fixed pay rates, and kitchen work was insultingly classified as janitorial service. So, she offered something rarer than money: respect. She instituted a rule that floor supervisors could never yell at her staff. She addressed mistakes privately with explanations rather than accusations. And most scandalously, she ate with them. Every day, Edith Clark took her lunch in the kitchen, sitting on a flour sack or a wooden stool, eating the same food from the same plates as her workers. She listened to their stories of sick children and husbands missing in the Pacific. She couldn't fix the world, but she ensured that their 12 hours in her kitchen wouldn't be the thing that broke them. The system's first true existential test came in March 1943. A massive rail strike in Ohio paralyzed shipments across. By mid-1944, the Willow Run cafeteria system had become a self-sustaining miracle that defied every industrial logic. Accident rates on the assembly line dropped to historic lows, and productivity per worker hour reached a level that Ford's efficiency analysts couldn't explain through machinery alone. The food wasn't just fuel, it was a psychological signal. In a factory building, machines designed to destroy, Edith Clark's hot meals were the only thing that whispered to the workers that their lives still mattered. This success soon caught the attention of the highest levels of military logistics. In August, 2 Army quartermasters, high-ranking officers in civilian clothes to avoid drawing attention, visited Willow Run. They spent 4 hours in Edith's basement office, reviewing binders of data thick enough to stop a rifle round. One officer, a colonel named Raymond Hutchkins, who had watched men starve in Normandy due to minor shipment delays, asked her a pointed question. How much of this can we replicate on the front lines? Edith Clark looked him in the eye and answered with brutal honesty, "None of it." Her system relied on infrastructure that didn't exist in a war zone, stable electricity, uncratered roads, and a workforce that didn't have to flee from falling bombs. But then Hutchkins asked a second question. If you had to feed this many people with half the resources, what would you cut first? Edith didn't hesitate. "Variety," she said. "I would serve beans, rice, and Spam 3 times a day if it meant everyone ate. You can rebuild morale later, but you can't resurrect the dead." 3 months later, that exact logic appeared in the revised Army feeding protocols for the Pacific Theater. Edith Clark was never credited, but every Marine who ate a hot meal on Okinawa owed their survival to a woman. The end of Willow Run came not with a bang, but with a sudden, deafening silence. On August 15, 1945, Japan surrendered, and the world began to exhale. But for Edith Clark, there was no celebration. Within 72 hours, the massive production schedules were slashed by 60%. The empire of food she had built to sustain 42,000 warriors dissolved in just 6 weeks. By October, 8 of her 12 fortresses were shuttered permanently. The industrial stoves went cold, the conveyors stopped moving, and the supply contracts were canceled with a stroke of a pen. Ford offered her a comfortable corporate position in Dearborn, a quiet job with regular hours and a respectable title. She declined. The work no longer required the fire she had burned for 3 years, and without that fire, she didn't know who she was. Edith Clark walked away from Ford in November 1945 with a severance check and a letter of recommendation that failed to mention she had run the most complex domestic logistics operation of the war. For the next 30 years, she managed hospital cafeterias in Ann Arbor, applying the same principles of precision, respect, and resilience on a scale that no one noticed. She never spoke of the war. When a local historian reached out in 1974, she refused to be interviewed, stating simply that the work was necessary, not heroic. To Edith, heroism was a word used by people who hadn't been there to see the sweat and the blood in the flower dust. She died in 1981, 3 weeks after her 79th birthday. Her obituary mentioned her long service at the hospital, but the name Willow Run was nowhere to be found. The buildings were demolished in 1958, and the massive oven. To understand why Edith Clark's system was a masterpiece of engineering, one must look at the machines she forced into existence. The egg crisis was the perfect example. 90,000 eggs a day is a statistic. Cracking them is a physical impossibility for a standard kitchen staff. Edith tracked down a small machinery supplier in Detroit who had been tinkering with automated crackers for large-scale bakeries. She didn't just buy their machines. She brought their engineers into Ford's world-class machine shops. For 2 weeks, they worked under her direct supervision to scale a fragile process into an industrial assault. The result was a contraption that looked like a silver staircase for eggs. They rolled single file onto padded conveyors, were struck by a precision blade at a mathematical angle, and emptied into chilled vats at a rate of 1,200 per hour. Edith ordered 6. They ran 18 hours a day, a mechanical heart beating in sync with the hungry masses above. Her obsession with efficiency extended to the very waste the system produced. In Edith's world, waste wasn't just inefficiency, it was sabotage. She built a tracking system more rigorous than Ford's own parts inventory. Meat arrived pre-butchered to save time. The bones were sent to rendering plants to be converted into glycerin for explosives. The fat was reclaimed to make soap for the plant's decontamination stations. Even the scraps were sold to local hog farms that, in a perfect circle of wartime economy, supplied the next week's pork. This was the fundamental difference between American and German logistics. Post-war analysis of captured Wehrmacht documents revealed a haunting truth. At its peak, the Nazi war machine relied on conquest as a food service. German soldiers ate what they could steal from Ukrainian farms and Polish villages at gunpoint. It was a system built on plundering. It could only survive as long as there was new territory to invade. But Ford's system, perfected by Edith Clark, was built on production. It relied on railroads, refrigeration, and the unglamorous science of moving goods without breaking the chain. One system was built on theft. The other was built on a woman's belief that a worker fed with dignity would produce more than a soldier fed with fear. The Nazis fed an army to sustain a conquest. Edith fed an army to sustain a machine. In the end, the machine that stayed fed was the one that won the war.